right, good to see everybody this morning. Glad you're out. I know it's kind of a drizzly, rainy day, but it's always good to be with God's people, study the Bible, and worship God. Real quick, before we get started, I'm not sure if it's been resolved. There was a Honda Odyssey, a gray Honda Odyssey parked right on the front here. Did it get it? Okay. All right, the light's wrong, but that's been taken care of. All right, if you were looking for notes this morning, the table's full of notes. So you've got there's two sheets in the back that are applicable for today. One's the cover sheet for Hebrews. The other is a set of notes for today that deals with introductory issues. And if you looked, there's also a set of notes for chapter 1, which is next week. Those are on the back table. And then Wednesday night, I had failed to print the notes for Wednesday, and those are back there too. So there's also some for the existence of God that deals with the design of the universe and how we look at design and discern that God exists. So there's quite a few notes on the back table. Today you will need the notes for the introduction to the book of Hebrews. So if you want to, just randomly, if you can just open your Bible to Hebrews and just mark it, we're going to be looking at a few Bible verses to go along with some of the points that we make this morning in our introduction. So we'll let everybody get settled on the notes. All right, without delving too much into our questions, let me offer a question that that's not in the notes, but it's just about your impression of Hebrews. What do you think about the book? What's your impression of the book of Hebrews? Over the years, as you've read through the book and you've studied it, what does it speak to you? What do you get out of Hebrews? Yeah, it does a great job of bridging the Old and the New Testament together. There's a lot of Old Testament references, and so if you're for a person who is trying to grasp what the purpose of the Old Testament was and what the purpose of the New Testament was, Hebrews is a great book for that. Terry, you said something. Yeah. Yeah, it has a lot of that, very, very historical from the standpoint of how it uses the Old Testament. You'll find it in I've not done a count, but if you did a count of Old Testament quotations or references in Hebrews, it would likely be the leading book of the New Testament in the number of Old Testament references because it does a great job in that. All right, any other general impressions of the book? Yeah, Philip? No doubt. When we start next week, that's going to be his point. The writer's going to immediately say Jesus is superior, and he's going to start contrasting him. Matthew does quote quite a bit. Yeah, he sure does. He sure does, Don.
When I think about Hebrews, the word faith
Yeah.
comes to me because there's a lot of places in there
No
talking
question.
about faith.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of emphasis on faith, developing faith. It's a tremendous book that puts a lot of emphasis on the personal faith and the growth of personal faith. Joel?
Yeah, and you've also got to wonder, how would you rate the difficulty? There is some difficulty. Peter said some of it right away, but if you can remember, what is the purpose of this book?
Yeah. So let's go to straight question number one. Joel mentioned that. Let's go to question number one. When you're reading the book of Hebrews, how would you rate the difficulty of that book? Is it an easy book to read and understand, or is it more difficult than others? What do you think, Tommy?
I think it depends on your knowledge of the Old Testament.
Okay, yeah.
Because if you have a good grasp,
Pretty good grasp.
no law,
Yeah.
it's a lot easier.
Yeah, I would think so. I think a lot depends on what you have, what your skill set going into the book. I think that has a lot to do with it. If people rated the top 3 books of the New Testament that would be much more difficult than others, you think Hebrews would probably make the list? I think it makes the list. Can you guess the other 2 as far as ranking? Revelation would be one. Yeah, Romans would be the other. And so as far as the 3 most difficult books, as far as perception is concerned, these are rated the most difficult books of the New Testament. And for different reasons, right? They're just different reasons for rating those books. They're not all the same. Romans is different than Hebrews. They're all different from Revelation. But in fact, when people list difficult books of the New Testament, without fail, Hebrews makes the list. We recently, in one of our Sunday night sermons, we made a reference to 2 Peter 3:16. And not that it has any bearing on Hebrews, not that it's a reflection of the authorship of Hebrews, but Peter makes just a generic statement, and he says, he's talking about the writings of Paul, and he said, there are some things that Paul's written that are much more difficult to understand. And that's true of a lot of books of the Bible. They're just some harder books of the Bible. They're not impossible, but they are harder books. And I think, and this goes back to what Tommy was saying, it's because Hebrews is a very deep book. There's some application made in Hebrews, some subject matter that's addressed that is not addressed in any other book, maybe just briefly, sort of very lightly in other books of the Bible, that we're called to put our attention to. And if we're not settled, for example, the issue of priesthood, if we don't have a real good understanding of that from the Old Testament, Hebrews becomes a really hard book because you've got comparisons of priesthoods, and if I don't understand that, then it could be that's a really deep subject. It's one of those kind of make you sweat subjects because there's a lot of deep reflection on the meaning of that. Look at Hebrews chapter 5. I think this reference I think it fits under the category of this question. Hebrews chapter 5. I actually want to start. You may have a heading that divides verse 11 from verse 12. It's all one part of the argument. It's not really separated. But just to preface the reading of verse 11, he starts back in chapter 4. Now you get back in chapter 2, you're already introduced to the intercessory work of Jesus, that he's the mediator between God and man. So you start getting priesthood as early as chapter 2. But it's chapter 4, he just delves into the subject of priesthood. You get it in chapter 4, chapter 5, and really all the way through chapter 10. It's all about the priesthood of Jesus and what that means. And then he says in verse 11, of whom we have much to say. Now that's about the priesthood of Jesus. And then he says, and hard to explain since you become dull of hearing. Well, that itself would indicate that the subject matter is a much more difficult subject matter. And then he says, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, verse 12, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he's a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Now, if we're reading that, and he's applying it to the readers about the subject matter in the book, would you say that Hebrews is a milk or a meat book? It's meaty. I mean, there's some really very, very deeply reflective, contemplative subjects in the book, and hopefully we can address those as we go through the book. So it's a very maturing book of the Bible. To grasp Hebrews really advances our faith. It brings our faith along, but the contrast is also true. And if you're reading through the book already, you're sort of combing through it and getting ready for some of our discussion, you may have noticed that there's a lot of contrast to that idea in the book, that while Hebrews has the ability to mature our faith, neglecting that material can have catastrophic effect to our faith. For example, in chapter 6 and verse 1, there's the possibility of accepting invalidated religion. In chapter 6 and verse 12, we become slothful and apathetic. We lose hope, chapter 6, verse 19. In chapter 12 and verse 1, we might be prone to quit the race if we don't mature in our faith. In verse 12 of that same chapter, we can't really deal with adversity if we're neglecting the meat of Hebrews. In chapter 13 and verse 1, it might disrupt brotherly love. In chapter 13, verses 2 and 3, we end up with an abuse of hospitality. Chapter 13, verse 5, our priorities get rearranged, and then we forget to serve God faithfully. So Hebrews is a very important book, very, very important, for the reasons that you suggested. One is because it brings together the Bible and tells us really the essential purpose of both covenants, Old and New Testament. All right, so let's move to number 2. And some of these we don't know for a fact, like the dating and then the actual human writer of it. These things we can speculate at, and that might help us a little bit as we go to the book. Here's one of those, number 2. There is always debate over dating of books. I don't care which book of the Bible it is. Somebody's going to debate the book of the Bible as far as the dating of it. And, of course, Hebrews is no exception. There's a lot of debate over when the book was written. And the only reason that makes a difference is because, just like Revelation, whether you date it late or date it early, it makes a difference as to the historical events that you apply to certain statements in the book. Some believe it's a very late addition to the New Testament, like one of the last editions. And then we posted some verses and said, what do you think, based on these verses, is the dating of the book? What's your thought on this? Do you think it's a late addition to the New Testament or earlier than that? Think it's late? Okay. Any other thoughts? Any varying opinion on that? Seems to be before destruction of Jerusalem? Yeah. Okay. Terry? Okay, that would put it before destruction of Jerusalem, mid-60s. Okay, let's look at a few verses and see if they give us a little hint as to when the book may have been written. And again, we can't say definitively. All we can look at is language in the book and say, if this is an indication of the reality of that situation, it may suggest when the book was written. So let's take a look. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 7. Hebrews chapter 7. Now, one of the things we will see in Hebrews is you'll see a lot of contrast between current practices going on, and we think, if you're reading the book, it seems like a really almost primarily Jewish audience, and he seems to be writing to people who are living in the midst of these things, and there's a lot of contrast between what they see taking place and what the Lord wants them to do. So look at verse 8 of chapter 7, and let's listen carefully to verse 8. Here, now when he says here, what would that indicate? Okay, right in the present time, and whether you think it's Jerusalem or some other place, he's still talking about what they're able to look at and see. Here, mortal men receive, and what are they receiving? They're receiving tithes. But there he receives them, of whom it is written, or whom it is witnessed that he lives. And he's talking about the contrast between earth and heaven. But he says, right now on earth, men are receiving tithes. What does that sound like to you? It's still going on. It sounds like the Jewish religion is still taking place, and they're still receiving tithes. Because who would be the people receiving the tithes? The priests in Jerusalem would be receiving the tithes. If this is an indication of when the book was written, it almost sounds like it would be prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, because when Jerusalem was destroyed, it never came back the way that it was. All those things stopped and they were dispersed. Stay in the book. Go to chapter 8. Look at verse 4. This is an argument about Jesus. Actually, we could start back in verse... let's just go back to verse 1. All right, so this is sort of the midway point. He's making a conclusion based on everything. He says, this is the main point of the things we're saying. We have such a high priest who's seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens, minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle which the Lord erected and not man. Watch verse 3. For every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices. Therefore, it is necessary that this one also have something to offer. For if he were on earth, he would not be a priest, since there are priests who offer the gifts according to the law. What does it sound like is still going on currently? They're offering gifts according to the law. Now, that does not mean that the law was still in vogue, but they're still trying to do it according to the law, right? You have this competition where there's still people who haven't accepted Christianity, and they're saying, we must abide by the law, and they're still trying to do things according to the law. Sure sounds like that's still going on. Same chapter, look at verse 13. Now, he's just mentioned you've got still people doing this in verse 13. In that he says, a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete, right? So it's of force, of power, it's been taken away, right? It's gone. Now what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So it is obsolete. It's been done away with in the sense that the Lord's blood has brought in a new covenant. But up until the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, were there still Jews trying to practice the Jewish law? And the priesthood still operating in Jerusalem, and all that continued up until that time? It just sure seems like these references do that. Go to chapter 13. Let's just do one more, and we'll move on to another thing. And again, I certainly wouldn't be dogmatic, but it's going to affect the way we apply some historical things to the book. Okay, chapter 13. Chapter 13. And there's a reason, if this is the context of it, there's a reason why statements like this would be made. And I think we're about to get into that when we're talking about the purpose of the book. You're talking about people who are really struggling with whether Christianity is valid or not, and they're looking out and seeing the physical practice of Judaism, and they're really struggling with that. And so in verse 10, he says, we have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat. But you clearly have people who are still apparently hooked on the Jewish religion, and it seems to be that all of these things are a reference to things happening prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. And then I think you could probably add the passage that Tommy mentioned earlier, which is Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, and he talks about that you commit yourself to being faithful, and as you see the day approaching, you see this day approaching, and I would not take that to be a reference to the end of the world, because you can't see that day approaching, right? You just know it's going to happen someday. But that seems like they're aware of things that are brewing in history that lead them to that. Then there's some external evidence for that might lead us to believe that it was written much earlier. There's a few letters, and I don't want to get too much into the letters, and especially when we get to authorship, but Clement of Rome wrote in AD 95, he wrote some letters in AD 95, and he used parts of the book of Hebrews in his letter, in his first letter to the Corinthians. Now, if he's writing and quoting in AD 95, would that suggest the book was written probably a lot earlier than that? Had to be, right? And then the Shepherd of Hermas, which is written around the same time, also shows heavy influence from the book of Hebrews, which would suggest that it's probably written much earlier. So even though I would never be dogmatic, and if you just think those are, you're writing by inspiration, and the Holy Spirit can have you put anything in the book, I think it's probably written earlier. And so when we make some historical applications, those will be some of the historical applications we'll be making in the book. All right, so let's get to number 3. I do want to talk about this. This one matters probably more than anything. Whether we figure out when the book was written or who wrote the book is probably not as important as knowing what the book is about, because we want to make proper application of the book. So number 3, consider the following verses, and we just put down a bunch. Chapter 13:22, chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, chapter 3:12, chapter 5:11, chapter 10, verse 25, chapter 12, verse 12. Any of those verses or ones you want to add to it, considering those, why do you think the book of Hebrews was written? What do you think is the purpose of the book? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Yeah, Philip?
Read to them because if they've been Christians so long, they should have recognized that the Levites was the only one that could be a priest. Christ wasn't a tribe of Levi. And so he's saying, hey, look, you people been Christians long enough that you shouldn't just be babies anymore. You need to grow up.
There's definitely a charge in the book about them not maturing the way they should have matured. Now, if you think about this, let's say the book was written in the mid-60s, which is, you either probably take it there or if you take it much later, but let's just say in the mid-60s, at the very least, the mid-60s. And if these are Jewish people, many of them likely converted around the time of Pentecost, or even some on Pentecost, what's the time distance there? What are you talking about? about 30 years, 3 decades. And there's a charge within the book where the writer's saying, you haven't grown to the point that you yourself can be a teacher of these things. So Philip, I 100% agree that part of the book is a charge against them by saying, in this amount of time, you're expected to have grown in that amount of time, right? There's no time. God certainly allows time, but He does expect within a time limit, right, in His own patience for people to grow in their faith, and they really hadn't done that. Joel?
I keep going back to Galatians, because
Yes.
Paul addressed, this was happening to people that Paul had apparently preached to. And I believe it occurred before the destruction of Jerusalem. So I would place it somewhere between Paul's missionary journey and the destruction of Jerusalem. I mean, that's a wide span. Right?
Sure, yeah.
But this was already going on when he wrote to that. He said, I'm astonished that you are so quickly removed from what, and then he goes to say, I preached to you, you know.
Yeah, and I hope what you've done already is I hope you've kind of read through the book or you're sort of scanning the book. What does it seem like is the real problem of the people in the book? Yeah, that seems like the real appeal in Hebrews is that they're really torn between should we hang on to Judaism or should we give ourselves totally to Christianity? And it does sound like, Joe, I completely agree that it does sound a lot like Galatians. Galatians is a book where Paul just flat out addresses the issue and said, you can't go back under the law. And Hebrews tends to do that too. That was a huge issue, especially for people who had come out of Judaism. It was a huge issue in the first century for those people. And it seems like the majority of Hebrews is geared toward that, with some side issues like you've not matured. Let's talk about priesthood and things of that sort, because you've got a contrast between Christianity and the law of Moses, and you got words that tell us that perhaps that's the very idea, because have you ever noticed in reading the book of Hebrews that every time he talks about Christianity, he uses the word better? Have you noticed that? Better covenant, better mediator, better testament, better priest. He goes through and shows that the New Testament is better. Tommy?
Well, in showing that contrast, and the problem that many of them had as far as maybe not understanding not only the difference between the law, but not looking at Christ as superior.
Yeah.
And one of the fallacies of premillennialism is the fact that their teachings say that the old law will be reestablished. And, you know, the old law most definitely was not up to par with Christ and the new law. And I think there's a significance between the two in that they were missing.
Yeah, and a lot of that, yeah, I got some hands, and I'll make a comment. Go ahead, Terry, and then Don. Terry, I saw your hand.
I was gonna say that there was a lot of internal and external pressure to get these Christians to come back.
Yeah, no question.
To me,
Yeah.
it's chastisement and encouragement.
Yes, so there's both, yeah,
I think
absolutely.
a lot of them were still wrestling just with who Jesus Christ was.
Yes,
I think many people back then, as today, missed the point that Jesus Christ is the single high priest
yes.
between earth and God.
Yeah, so let's do this real quick. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of a first century Jew growing up in a Jewish community and converted out of that into Christianity. What have you been used to all of your life? What have you seen? What have you heard? What are you used to? So you're used to going to a physical temple? What'd you say, Terry? Yeah, you're used to going to the synagogue. You're used to seeing physical priesthood at work. You see these men, they're busy about the temple and the tabernacle, and you see this with your eyes. You hear it. You're part of a Jewish community, and all of a sudden now you're part of Christianity, and where is your priest at? Can you see him? Can't see him. Where is your citizenship? It's in heaven. And you don't have a physical thing like you used to have. That's a difficult thing for people to adjust to. Yeah.
Forsaking the assembly, so they're not growing, they're not learning.
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of that has to do with it, Barry. It's just the very opposite of that. That's right. Yeah, so what Barry's saying is, and they were struggling with that, right? Because in Hebrews chapter 8, he's going to quote from Jeremiah 31, where under the old law, you were born into a covenant relationship. You're circumcised on the 8th day to sort of certify that fact. But in the New Testament, based on what he says and the prophecy of Jeremiah, you're first taught. And then you're brought into it, and there's a whole different way of life. It's not automatic. You're just not physically born into a relationship. You have to be converted. Your mind, your heart has to be there. So everything is opposite now, and they're really struggling with that. Yeah. And then Philip, go ahead.
Well, I think when Jesus was talking to Nicodemus, he worded it the way that he did.
Mm-hmm.
Nicodemus, knowing that under the Jewish law, you're born into the family. But Jesus says that you have to be born again. So that, puts a different twist on being born.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's turn to chapter 2. Philip, I saw your hand up. Let's turn to chapter 2.
One of them is a physical thing, and the other is a spiritual. They had to offer animals. Well, Christ is going to be an offer. We just have to obey rather than to offer physical stuff.
Yeah, and it's I don't want to chase too many rabbits, but and I don't know if just my reference to that would mean anything, but in Romans chapter 7, that's considered one of the hardest chapters in the Bible. I don't think it's that hard if you put it in this context. I was just going to say that in just that reference and put it in the form of a question. Did even Paul struggle with the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament? He really struggled with that. Romans 7, I think, is it's insight into Paul's mind, how much he struggled under the law before he became a Christian. And if that's true of Paul, it's true of anybody who came out of a system where there's such contrast between the two. Look at chapter 2. And this is a great set of verses to kind of show us what the writer is trying to accomplish with the readers. Verse 1, therefore we must give the more earnest heed to the things we've heard, lest we drift away. So what's the danger here? What are some of them potentially doing? They're falling away from the Lord. Verse 2, for if the word spoken through angels proved steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a just reward, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord and was confirmed to us by those who heard him? So there's real danger among the people who are receiving this letter that they're moving away from Jesus. They're being drawn back into something that cannot save them, and there's a real warning. Gene, and then
over this, as you see in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century,
Yeah.
and eventually Catholicism, priesthood,
yes,
and all of that came out of it. So it was a very contentious battle
yes,
during this time and in centuries to come.
yes, it was. That debate between the physical and the spiritual. Ken?
I'm going to take another track. I think the purpose of the book is where you get into chapter 11 and following, in that the law provided the difference between right and wrong and prescription on how to live. But he makes the case that it's not about that. On up through chapter 10, that it's a matter of faith that was exhibited by Abraham and those that followed and all that are mentioned in chapter 11. And that's how you have to live. And there's a difference between faith and then just belief.
Yeah, and that is certainly,
Trying to get that point across to them.
yeah,
That you really need to change your mindset about what this is all about.
yeah, and none of that, the difference between the physical and the spiritual, none of it makes sense without that faith, because he's going to define it as you trust God that this is right, and he's blessed people based on those promises. So I completely agree that faith is there, because you see a contrast in chapter 3 with their lack of faith, and then you see faith and how God rewarded that in chapter 11. So that is the foundation of every part of his exhortation to pull them back into Christianity. So the book aims to prevent their apostasy and remind them of the greatness of Jesus and the greatness of the covenant under which they live. And there's some strong rebuke in the book about their lack of growth and their forsaking the assemblies. Chapter 12, you see it in 12. Chapter 12, verse 12, I think, they're really discouraged. They're very, very discouraged by this fight over what is right. And that's why I think you see a couple of themes in the book. I already mentioned one of them, better. You see, for example, He's better than angels, chapter 1, verse 4. There's a better hope, chapter 7, verse 19. There's a better testament, chapter 7, 22. There's a better covenant, chapter 8, verse 6. There's better promises, chapter 8, verse 6. Better sacrifices, chapter 9, verse 23. A better substance, chapter 10, verse 34. A better country, chapter 11, verse 16. A better thing, chapter 11 and verse 40. A better resurrection, chapter 11, verse 35. So all of this is trying to encourage them to pull back to where they needed to be. And then there's a lot of exhortation in the book. This book is heavy on the let us statements. Let us do this. Let us do that. Let's do this. All these in an effort to show the superiority and exclusiveness of the new covenant. And for all the reasons that you mentioned, it's very much a book to try to save them, save their faith, and pull them back to where they need to be. Real quick, just because this book is so unique, you end up with a really different style of writing in Hebrews. It's unlike really any other book of the New Testament. It is said that the book of Hebrews begins like an essay and then progresses like a sermon, like he just starts preaching right in the middle of the book, and then ends like a letter. It becomes very personal at the end. And because of the purpose and the audience, there's some really unique things that happen in Hebrews that you just don't find in other books. There's a lot of unique paradoxes and some contrasts in the book. And the book largely focuses on, someone said it earlier, it really focuses on the superiority of Jesus. And really, it's the key to everything. If you believe that Jesus is number one, then it solves all the other issues. But if you're unconvinced of that, then you end up teetering with other things. And so you'll see this contrast through the book about Jesus versus the prophets and Jesus versus the angels, and infants versus adults, and Abel versus Cain, and daily sacrifices versus the one-time sacrifice of Jesus, and types versus antitypes, and Sinai versus Zion. You see all these contrasts as a way of trying to convince the people of what is right. All right, so real quick, we've got just a few minutes left. To me, the single biggest controversy surrounding Hebrews is always about the authorship of the book, about who wrote the book. And so just at the very outset, it's part of the Bible. It's the inspired Word of God. That part is absolutely true. 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 20 and 21, never at any time did anybody pick up the pen to write part of Scripture without being borne along by the Holy Spirit. And according to 2 Timothy 3:16, all Scripture is given by inspiration of God, and that much is true. And based on the standards of canonicity, right? Is it inspired? Does it claim inspiration? Can we see divine authorship of this book? Is the human writer someone that we believe to be a prophet, an apostle, or connected or confirmed by God in some way? And the book mentions that. Is the content in harmony with everything else in the Bible? Does it have the ring of genuineness? We know it's part of the canon. What we do not know with certainty is who wrote the book. Now, before we talk about men, we can narrow it down. I think this helps us a lot. There are some things in the book that help us to understand a certain few qualities of this person, and it's going to get us out of the category of some into the category of another. The first thing that we know about this writer is the writer is a male, a male gender. We know that for a fact. Go with me to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. And go with me to verse 32. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32. Listen carefully to this beginning statement. And what more shall I say? Now, who's that? That's the writer. The writer is saying that. And what's interesting about that is this is a masculine participle. What more shall I say? And it assigns gender by the way that it's phrased. So the first thing we know is the writer is a male. That's indicated in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32. The second thing we know was that he was not one of the original 12 apostles. Whether he's an apostle or not, he just wasn't in that group. So it's not one of the original 12. Go back to chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2. And we read this earlier, but let's go back to verse 3. He says, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at the first began to be spoken by the Lord, and was confirmed to us by those who heard him? So what's he saying there? I wasn't there with Jesus, but that testimony was confirmed by the men who were with the Lord. That would be the original apostles, the disciples of the Lord. And whoever the writer is a male who was not part of the 12 disciples, part of the apostleship during the Lord's own personal ministry. And I think the third is an assumption based on this book. Would you think that the writer of this book is a Jew or a Gentile? I think he's Jew. I can't prove that. But based on the heavy emphasis on the law and the contrast of the law to the New Testament, it sounds like somebody who is a Jew. The manner of writing seems to be of the same ethnic background as the readers. And the readers are obviously, it's a Jewish audience, obviously. So the question is, given those qualities, who might it be? Yep, Gene? Okay, could be. Patterns, yeah. So, okay. So obviously there are some who would take it to be not Paul. Philip? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so already, I'm not going to stop the rest of you from talking about, already, what does this tell us? Nobody knows who wrote the book. You can have strong opinions about it, right? But nobody really knows who wrote the book. It's just best guess. That's all, Joel?
2 weeks ago, I was 90% sure that Paul wrote it. I've got that about 50% that Paul wrote it.
It's confusing. Yeah. So let me just really quickly, and I'm going to quickly, because we're about to get buzzed on time here, really quickly go through some opinions on this. The most widely accepted, who do you think the most widely accepted is? Yeah, most people think Paul wrote the book. There are even some early church fathers, patristic writers, who argue for Paul. There are a lot of terms and phrases, like Philip was mentioning, that appear in some of Paul's writings that do appear in the book of Hebrews. Where he just certain words that are sort of heavily used in Paul's writings that end up in the book. Even some of the circumstances, and I think this goes back to what Joel mentioned earlier, the circumstance of Hebrews seems a lot like the circumstance of Galatians.
Well, I know who wrote the book. Holy Spirit.
The Holy Spirit wrote the book, yeah, and outside of human writer, we don't know. But there does seem to be some similarity between like books like Galatians, or some of the things he said about Timothy with Paul. Also, there's a number of similar themes, like Paul also often mentions shadows and types, and you find that in the book. He often talks about weakness. You see that in the book of Hebrews. But, just so you know, there are arguments opposed to Paul. The style and the overall language of Hebrews is very different than anything Paul ever wrote. Even the style of Greek is different as it appears in the book of Hebrews. There's a lot of words that appear in this book that are unique, and they are never found in any of Paul's writings. The thoughts of the epistle are very different than things that Paul wrote. And then a hang-up for some is 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 17, where Paul literally says, I sign all my letters. And it literally means there's some sort of mark within the letters that would indicate Paul, and in Hebrews, it doesn't appear. So for a lot of those reasons, people say, well, I don't know that it was Paul. Some think it was Apollos. Apollos could have been. He was very mighty in the Old Testament. Remember that? Acts chapter 18. He was an Alexandrian Jew. He was an eloquent man, meaning he was learned and cultured. He was mighty in the Scriptures. He taught the things of the Lord accurately, and he had connection to Paul. Could have been him, but there's no historical support, and there's no other known writings for Apollos. Some people think it was Barnabas. Barnabas was a Levite, according to Acts chapter 4. He was Cyprian by birth, which would get him an access to a lot of the style of writing that you see in Hebrews. He was also called the son of encouragement, and you see a lot of effort of encouragement in the book. There are some church writers like Tertullian and a few others that thought Barnabas had written it. Silas is an option because he was a Jew. He knew Paul. He was a member of the church at Jerusalem, apparently, in Acts chapter 15, verse 22. There's some others, but again, who knows? Some people think Luke wrote the book. But Hebrews has very good Greek, but Luke was also not a Jew, and so maybe that would legislate against that. Some people think Timothy, Aquila. Some people think Mark wrote the book. That is John Mark or Titus or even Epaphras. The truth is, we just don't know. And I'm satisfied with exploring those and looking at those and not knowing for sure, because one day we'll find out. But what I do know is it's part of the Bible, and we get to explore it and we get to learn from it. And so next week, Chapter 1. We're going to try to finish Chapter 1 next week. It's not as difficult as it seems when you look at it, because there's basically 3 sections to it. And a lot of the intersection is just a lot of Old Testament quotes to prove one thing about Jesus. So take a look at those questions, and I look forward to your thoughts on Chapter 1 next week. Thank you, guys. It's going to be a good study. I'm really excited about it.